sex has completely changed. It's cut off from its origins. He makes his little bower and he arranges it all perfectly. He's obsessive. The female comes and she's like,
that little twig right there is out of place.
if he delivers, she will reward. Brett and Heather have this concept called lineage selection. So I've always kind of had this in mind that I want a powerful lineage. Who do I give this cattle to if I die? Who's in your patriline? And so there becomes a deal between men and women in exchange for, I will reward myself exclusively to you. I go to Bible study. No, yeah, I read it every week. I want to understand the rise and fall of my civilization. Think about the Israelites. They do not lose their God. They keep their God. How do they do that? Persian Empire actually maintained a multicultural, multi-religious empire without falling into any of these traps. People, when they get into things like X-risk and sense-making, it's like, put on your monocle. Like, yes, here we are. We're trying to dive into these serious topics, but also we're all fools. I was like, oh, there's like this bodybuilding guy.
And you see my hair, right? That's my COVID hair.
I know.
Recording. Welcome everyone to another brand new episode of Noetic Nomads. I'm Albert Kim, unofficial nonsense maker in residence of the Stoa. And with me today is a Stoan who actually has coherent ideas to share with the world. A queen bee, or should I say queen P as in philosopher, amongst the sea of cerebral wannabe sperm donors, simping in service of the overlord, which is Ovum. As matriarch of the Stoa, she helped midwife into existence radical ideas, insights, connections, and conversations with sessions of the likes of Socratic speed dating, the future of love, sex, and friendship with Nina Power, and the aptly titled Philosopher Queens with fellow badass and empress of the aesthetic Rachel Haywire. Ladies, gents, and those of us on the fence, please help me in introducing a conduit of the dangerous Dionysian who transcends the fad of the trad versus feminist, of the traditionalist versus polemicist, and of staid notions of the masculine and feminine to serve as a go-between, mediator, and one of our many tribal mothers, giving birth to the more beautiful world we know in our hearts is possible. I could be speaking of none other than the brainy blackbird herself, the one and only Raven Connolly. Thank you so much for coming on today.
Thank you. Thank you.
I guess that's all you can say with that. Yeah, I mean, thank you so much for coming on. I mean, I've been really wanting to get you on. And when I saw your little tweet storm the other day, I was like, oh my God, this is perfect to get her on. So again, thank you so much. And there's a lot to talk about. For those who are unaware, we are recording this on Thursday, January 7th. The day after, the day after, the Capitol riots. I don't know if it has an official name yet, but yeah, that happened. And we're going to get into that real quick. But first, actually, I want to know, do you remember how we first encountered each other or how you even became aware of Alberto's existence?
Alberto's existence. I feel like I don't remember precisely when you first came into my orbit, because I figure it was at a Stoa session, right? But I know for sure that I saw you around. You know, you were all of a sudden just like everywhere. That's kind of how it felt. You know, I knew you were around, but then suddenly there was like your Twitter presence and you were doing all these events and you invited me to your Mixer event. And I think that's when it really became clear to me that you're doing something special in this space.
Cool, thank you.
And that's my, kind of acquaintance with you. But when do you remember that we kind of like came into
This
orbit?
is the very interesting thing, because my first Stoa session was actually one that you were facilitating. Oh. In fact, I'm going to pull it up right now.
Oh, God.
Hold. I know. I'm sorry. I had to do this. So I will share this with the world.
Good. Oh, Samo.
Can you hear that?
Thank you. Yeah, a little bit.
Can you hear that? You can't. Oops.
Yeah,
okay,
no, I could hear it. Okay.
Okay.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Samuel, I love what you're talking about right now. I have like a mind boner just listening to you. And so quick, do you actually remember that or no?
I actually completely remember you now. Yeah, I completely remember this.
You know why? I'll always remember this because I remember when I said, Samuel, I have a mind boner. I saw you and you just started laughing. So this is what I remember. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I completely remember. I was like, oh, there's like this bodybuilding guy. Who is this bodybuilding guy?
And you see my hair, right? That's my COVID hair.
I know. That's why I didn't recognize. Yeah. And your setup is literally different now. Okay. Yeah. We go way back, Albert.
Exactly.
Way back.
And this was the crazy part. Wait, so you could hear the sound, right? Clearly?
Yeah.
Okay. So this is what's crazy. Now, I was looking back on this video, right? And I was like, oh, yeah, this is my first appearance. Let me look at it. And then what I actually talked about is actually kind of crazy because when I, look into your history and then what I talked about in my first session, like this is what I talked about. Hurry up.
But I'm playing around with biology as a framework because like I look at what human beings are doing as like becoming a superorganism. I've heard people use biological, as like a metaphor, but I actually see that literally as what we're doing right now, and I actually see us becoming a superorganism as like basically what we're trying to do. And my point is, I believe that biology has like countless examples of successfully instantiated anti-rival games, like serial endosymbiosis, where we actually have...
Okay, that's enough of that. But anyway, I think you get the point. So
I do see what connection you're trying to make.
Yeah, that is very weird. So for those who are unaware, you studied evolutionary biology. I don't know if that's the exact term, at Evergreen State College with a couple names people may have heard of, Brett Weinstein and Heather Hying. So there was just so much synchronicity there, and we could get into that. But first, let's address the elephant in the room, the elephant that burst into the Capitol building and took photos and put them all on Twitter. So
the Q shaman.
The Q shaman. Yeah, it's just like, okay, so again, like this happened the day after that all happened. And the way I want to frame this is because, like I mentioned, you were at Evergreen State College and when that whole fiasco happened, and then you later moved to Portland. And then shortly after you moved to Portland, there was a whole lot of craziness going down. That could be considered even ground zero of the mess that's happening right now. And then yesterday happened. So, and especially like you, I looked into your background. You grew up in Olympia. You're very much into like anarchism and like radical movements. But it's just like where you are right now and seeing what's happened. Like, what is your take on what the hell's going on right now? I'm very curious.
Yeah, I'm just going to preface this to say that I feel like my attitude about politics right now is that of observation and curiosity rather than prescription or condemnation. So I feel like often the political conversation ends up being, do I condone or do I not condone this action or behavior or this person or this party or this whatever? And I'm like pretty tired of that as a trap, basically, for conversation. And then the other thing is prescribing things. Well, they ought to do this, or they ought to do that, or they should have done that, or they should not have done that. I'm also not really, personally, I don't actually feel like I have the background in political economy to even prescribe anything. So I think my position, especially going into what I am anticipating is going to be a tumultuous kind of political future for America and the West more generally, looking at like what's happening in the UK, coming to the situations, these events, with a prescribed notion of what ought to be the case or what is good behavior, I think is a cognitive bias that ought to be corrected for. So that's just my preface here, is that I don't know, right? Like, I have no idea, right? What's happening, what's going on. What I'm seeing is what seems to be a kind of barbarian, mob, like, after a football game, that gets all riled up and ends up breaking into a mall or something like that, or like or a Trump hotel, and just running around and like playing. I think we're seeing so much of our political action these days is within the realm of LARPing. It's really live action role playing. It's really for the camera. So there's really, I think the Society of the Spectacle, which was, the Situationist Manifesto, really illustrates a lot of our political circumstances today, and what really kind of undermines genuine political action. Although I'm at this point remaining agnostic as to what actually would be genuine political action. I don't really know at this point. It's like, on the one hand, if you care about the symbols of America, I could see how any of these recent movements would be quite frustrating. Trump coming into the White House is obviously a kind of desecration of the sense of American elitism. He used the symbols around him to kind of smear or make profane the sanctity of the Oval Office. You see that happening in the kind of anarchist BLM movements, where they burn the flag and they have a very kind of anti-American aesthetic. And then you also see, I think the Trumpists are also desecrating America, even though they present themselves as if they are, the ones saving the face of America. In reality, this event is a complete humiliation of the competency of the state and also of Trump's followers and Trump himself. Like, everybody just looks absolutely incompetent. I think in response to this, like, you can get a laugh out of it. I've laughed at plenty of memes. I've laughed at plenty of this. This is hilarious. Yeah. That's the thing. This is funny.
It's funny. It's crazy. I'm laughing right now, but it's crazy. It's crazy what's going on about it. Yeah.
It's funny. It's like funny that, and this has been the case, I think, since the beginning with Trump. Like, this is kind of a reality TV show for him, and it continues to be so. But rather than that being the case only for him, it's actually something that's the case for most of us as we continue to integrate with this medium. And of course, we're doing that even more intensively now. I think that that's kind of my high-level response to this. Is I'm not quite sure where I am in terms of like my vantage point, because on some level I feel like protecting competency is something I'm interested in, but on the other hand, I feel like we have incompetency within the government, within institutions, and within the populace that's like so widespread that what's the purpose of protecting the symbols of competency when you don't have the substance of it? So like, in terms of where to go, I'm actually not entirely sure in terms of condemning or condoning or prescribing anything, but that's just my kind of diagnostic.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I definitely resonate with that. Like, again, like, we're not trying to choose sides and be prescriptive here. But like, as I did mention in my intro, I do see yourself, whether it's intentionally or not, acting as like a go-between. Like, I know, like, you've kind of represented yourself as like an androgen, like as a go-between, and you speak of Alexander Bard's work, and I've gotten into his work recently as well. And I see myself reflected in his concepts of like the shamanoid, the one that goes between the different worlds, right? And then like, and for example, the shamanoid, he takes like vows of celibacy many times. He's seen as like a conduit to the divine, to God. And he walks through the battlefield without being touched, because he's like the mediator between all this. And I find this fascinating, because I don't know if you've listen to any of my episodes where I go into my history, but I am actually voluntarily celibate. I'm a virgin by choice. I openly talk about how I feel like I'm channeling the universe. And one of my things, like, as you were part of the next generation of Sensemaker and Changemakers event, I'm like consciously trying to bring the tribes together. I got into Bard's work after I started doing all this. So I find it insane that I am actually kind of exemplifying this in a way. And so it's kind of weird.
You're a bull cell. That's awesome.
Yeah, I know.
I love it. Yeah, I'm so into it. Yeah. Yeah.
So I'm just curious, like, if you could like speak about that. So again, like, I know you're into Bard's work and like the archetypes that I may be embodying, and maybe you're embodying, whether consciously or not, like it's happening.
Yeah. And yeah, in terms of tribal mapping, I feel conflicted about a lot of like my role or position within these worlds, because on the one hand, I think that this is maybe like, I have very kind of traditional aspirations in many respects. I aspire to be a mother and to have many children and to educate them and to raise them in the way in which I see fit, which would hopefully be in a, you know, interconnected community that would be bound through ritual and reverence for some sort of divine entities. Also, you know, obviously educated with in philosophy and science.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So on the, you know, I have these very kind of like traditional aspirations on the one hand, and I feel very connected to life in that sense, right? So like the sense of building the future, creating the future, that being through the lineage, through children. So my thinking really runs in the direction of what is the future as it comes through the children that hopefully I will bring into the world, but also the children that exist today and the children that will be born today, tomorrow, the next day, right? So I have that kind of sitting in you know, tugging me in some direction. But then I also have the desire to be out in the open, to talk to people, to kind of live a life that is quite, you know, disconnected from those kinds of responsibilities. I realize that there's not always trade-offs there, but I think that there are in many cases. And I guess I'm also beginning to understand the cost of being online in a much deeper sense. You know, it seemed like when I was kind of beginning last year, it seemed like there was so much upside to creating things online and drawing more people to my torch and to seeing who else was out there. And now I feel like I'm not so sure about moving forward in terms of like kind of like so-called like public life. And it seems like as well with, especially with this particular event, that the sensitivity that we're going to have to certain kinds of ideas is going to go up as much as it already has. I would say that I guess the shamanoid kind of characteristics for myself is I don't have the same kinds of aesthetic responses to dangerous ideas, let's say. So I, you know, read neo-reactionary material and, you know, get into all sorts of kind of like political or philosophical I think, you know, collapse philosophy, all sorts of stuff that, I mean, even anarchism, right? Like that's not really considered to be within the Overton window. And even traditionalist values aren't really seen as very acceptable in some circles. So there's a sense of caution. And I think a lot of this is connected to coming to terms to what I think it means to be a woman in some sense. So all of the, you know, all of these things are kind of entangled, and I'm not quite sure because I'm like, you know, in the sense of being the go-between, I don't think I'm the shaman. Like that, I guess that would be the easy answer. Like because I'm too attached to lineage to be the shaman. The shaman is.
You're right. Yes. I see.
So I would be potentially be an androgen in the sense of like the one who goes between the males and the females, but even then, I'm not quite sure about that because there's a kind of gambling with your lineage that you do when you're in those kinds of positions. And I don't know that I'm really willing to make that gamble. I think of myself more in some sense as being like the grandmother in like a young person's body. Like,
oh, really? Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, like I'm growing to be a grandmother, like I'm growing to be the matriarch, like the old woman who like carries the wisdom of her time and is genuinely wise. I mean, I think that not all old people are wise, right? And I think that for me, it's how can I take care of the people in my realm and make sure that their future is ensured, and kind of from the vantage point of this long perspective, of the intergenerational perspective, of the perspective of the old woman who sees her like, you know, she's 90 and she's looking at a 3-year-old, right? Like you have a sense of the future happening because you know that you're coming to an end and that this person is going to continue to grow, right? So That's, I don't know. Like, I don't know. I don't know where I am. You tell me.
I mean, what I see is I see someone just like me and just like all of us in a very liminal space. And it's a space of vulnerability, but it's also of unknowingness, but it's also of a lot of possibility. And I see it, and it's very intriguing. I very appreciate you sharing your perspective there. And like, again, like as you stated, it's like you are kind of like you're a bit of a traditionalist, but like I said, like you're not like in one of these boxes. You're kind of like transcending into like your own little thing. And I would like to go into actually the tweet that was my excuse to be like, Raven, let's come on. But I was like, I always wanted you to be on. But it was it happened on December 30th. And if I could just read it, you responded to someone who stated, I quote, "I'm a trad in that I'm extremely in favor of intelligent, powerful women having the right to stay home, take massive stimulants, read philosophy, maintain social ties, encourage good morals, and raise a generation of children brilliant enough to invent the internet." And you're like, high status. So I'm just curious. And then what you went into later is you got into a little, into a little thing with someone else. And you were talking about how, like, the person was like, oh my God, what is up with women? They always rewarding simp behavior. And you're like, take it up with evolution. The egg is master. And I'm like, this is something I'm very curious about. And I think a lot of people would be very curious to hear. So can you go into what it is that you mean when you say the egg is master and like kind of your emerging philosophy behind the egg?
Sure. Well, I mean, I think a lot of this ties into simping, right? Which is a pejorative for a certain kind of behavior where men prostrate for women online. But I think it also kind of extends outside of the online environment into real life. But of course, we see all these things happening in these public forums. And my feed is often filled with people like calling out simps, like it's, whatever. Also, there's just like been a lot of traffic around like men and women stuff recently in my feed, which like to some degree is fine, but and then in some cases it's just annoying. I think that there's like a huge lack of generosity about women in particular in some corners of Twitter that I, look at. Yeah, I mean, internet misogyny is like, it's there, right? So, and I don't know, like it's funny because in some senses, I've learned a lot about what it means to be a woman from, men going their own way or like whatever these incels or whatever, because they're like, based, and we'll just talk about what the dynamics are without trying to pretend like women are some sort of like perfect beings that never engage in questionable behavior or something like that. So yeah, in terms of the context of the tweet, I was indicating that this tweet that this man posted, where he was uplifting a notion of the woman as mother, but as also as educator. And well, the thing that really got me was that he had this insight that I don't always see on like whatever misogynist Twitter or whatever. That's not really what it is, but let's just use that for a second. Is that your wife is going to be a huge influence on your children. And she is going to be the one primarily educating them when they're small. And that, I mean, the whole notion, like, let's say, of the mother tongue, right? Like, she will literally be giving them their mother tongue by speaking to them. And the mother creates the world of the child in a very, like, deep, profound way that ends up being with the child for the rest of their existence, regardless of whether or not it went well. And so to me, this man like seems to be indicating and also signaling that he understands this connection between the mother and like the quality of that woman. So not like, low IQ woman who just does what she says, but a woman who actually is like well educated and capable and kind of playing this role within the community that actually benefits the lineage, benefits the children, and also benefits the husband. So I was like, okay, the fact that this guy is saying this is very high status behavior. Like, this is actually a man who understands what the hell's going on in terms of the dynamics between men and women and their children. And I wanted to signal that, you know, I think the person who tweeted thought that I was signaling merely to men, right? That like I was a woman who was rewarding simping behavior.
Okay, yeah, I see. Yeah.
You know, but I was as much indicating to men as I was indicating to women, right?
Yeah.
So I think like the whole dynamic between men and women has been just like completely aggravated, you know, lots of different reasons for that. But what I responded to when he called me out for rewarding simping behavior was that for men behaving in certain kinds of ways that you see as being desirable or not, right? So, and that runs all the way to the egg, right? You can look at the mating dynamics of birds, right? So the man or the male bird, let's like take a bower bird for example, like he makes his little bower, he gets all the little colors and he arranges it all perfectly. He's obsessive, right? He like spends all of his time like moving one branch, you know, to create this like perfect bower for the female. And the female comes and she's like,
that little twig right there, it's out of place.
she's like, no. Yeah. And you know, if he delivers, she will reward. So, and I think that's the underlying dynamic, right? Is if the male delivers, the female rewards. And that is kind of also within the gametes in the sense that the female is the stationary, expensive in the sense that it has more material in it. It actually has more like genetic material inside of it. So it's like stationary, it's fatty, and it's expensive, right? And because of that, it stays. It's something that you don't want to just spend that on anything, right? It's like you want to keep it protected, right? So the female has the job of protecting the egg and making sure that her egg goes to the best mate. And this is the dynamic of sexual selection, right? And the male, male literally being like the gamete that has less genetic material, moves fast, it's mobile, right? So it's the thing that's moving around. The egg is stationary and the sperm is coming to, right? It's moving to. So in this sense, you can think of it as coming to deliver itself to the egg. And the egg has to be ruptured, right? So the egg kind of delivers itself or rewards itself to this process. And the female organism can control whose sperm has the opportunity to access the egg. She's ultimately the gates of that. And she rewards herself, like she is the reward, kind of in this intrinsic sense. So I think of that as being one of like the underlying evolutionary dynamic. Obviously, we see all sorts of permutations in our current environment because sex has completely changed. Sex is something decoupled from reproduction. And we don't even have a framework that sees it arising out of reproduction anymore. You know, it's cut off from its origins and understood as merely like acts of pleasure between two people. And I don't take that perspective. I take more of an emergent perspective in the sense that I think from this like position within our evolutionary history and how it kind of arises, right? And so you have these underlying dynamics that rise to the next level of emergence. They get incorporated and included. They don't really fundamentally get transcended unless there's a serious change. And we haven't seen that yet. We're still bodies, you know. And from the perspective of evolution, it's kind of I don't know, I'd love to make an animation of this at some point, but like I have this visual in my mind that what's really happening over each generation is not, you know, a baby is born, grows, has a baby, is born, grows, has a baby, is born, but it's really like egg printing machine or a womb printing machine. It's like the womb is making more wombs, is making more rooms,
It's interesting. Yeah.
It's from that vantage point of those gametes, right? It's the gametes that, from an evolutionary perspective, are the most significant part of what we carry. And things that like celibacy or like all of these alternative ways dealing in the realm of sex and reproduction is a permutation. It's a human kind of invention or playing around with these types of dynamics. But that doesn't mean that the dynamics go away.
Yeah. I mean, I think it was really fascinating how you talked about how, like, and again, like, this whole thing, it continues on, like, the archetype keeps reproducing itself through different levels of complexity. And, like, for example, I mean, like, the old paradigm, the very masculinist paradigm was like, hey, the fittest sperm, the fastest guy who gets there is the winner. It's like, actually, no, it's like they're all dancing around the egg, the all expensive, the all important expensive egg, and eventually the egg is what allows, whichever sperm that allows in, that's what decides, what impregnates. It's interesting because, again, like, I don't talk about like the masculine and like the feminine archetypes, because like very much how they're like the sperm, there's so many sperm and there's only one egg. So obviously you got the expensive gamete versus the inexpensive one. This is very much played out in the male's role in society. Like, we're expendable. We could have one man impregnate an entire village worth of females, but and the rest of them can all be sent to war. We see this playing out all the time. And in fact, I see it myself. I was just saying recently, with all this craziness going on, I was like, you know what? I feel like something activated. It's like, I feel like I should be out on the battlefield right now. And what I would love to go out in a blaze of glory. To me, like, my dream is to have a glorious death. And I'm like, I won't even reproduce. And like, I just think that is so interesting, and that whole dynamic that continues to play out. One thing that I want to go into, and we're talking about again these archetypes and like how the inversion of the biological reality versus these myths that play out, like the creation myth of like Adam and Eve, and how like the creator in these Judeo-Christian traditions is that the father is the creator, and then the original human is a man. From the man comes the female, but then what it really is, the mother is creator. All humans start in the womb as female, and then once an acceptable threshold of testosterone is exposed to the fetus, that's when it becomes a male. And then again, and this is all contrary to again, what the biblical myths say. And like, the way that I see it is that the female actually created the male as a tool, like as a builder, as a defender, like a very cerebral, disembodied. And that's a lot of things that people talk about right now, how the male is very disembodied, and we're trying to get back to our bodies. But what happened, of course, is the tool took over, and that man is continuing this cycle with, for instance, AI. A tool that we created, which is even more cerebral, which is more disembodied in his head, and that it's going to take us over. So I see this kind of dynamic playing out again. And I know like you're into xenofeminism and some transhumanist work and accelerationist kind of thinking. So I just wondering what your particular thoughts on like with this trajectory that we're all going on, and possibly any archetypes that are being manifested.
Yeah, well, you brought up a lot of things. So
Sorry.
the Adam and Eve story, I think, is interesting to begin with, because it does run contrary to what looks self-evident, which is that all bodies come from the female body, because the woman is the gestator, right? She's the one who brings and carries the infant and brings that infant, male or female, into existence. And so we all kind of run back to our mothers in that sense. Whereas, in the creation story of Genesis, you have Adam, right? Which means like earthling, essentially, who I think actually is seen as being androgynous. There are interpretations that he's actually not male.
Really?
Until the female is made from his rib. And the thing about it is, like, if you think about where the female is made from, is she made from his head, as if she came from some higher place than him? No. She made from his foot, as if she is lower? No. She's made from his rib, which is a place of equality, right?
Oh, that's an interesting interpretation. Yeah.
So I think that there's a lot of mysteries in that story. She's also the penultimate, right? Once she has been created, God is done.
Yeah.
God has finished his work. The woman has been made, right? He kind of like gets up to her, and then she's the cherry on top, right? So I think in some sense there's a lot more that we can get out of those stories than just, woman is subordinate to man, et cetera, et cetera. I think in some sense the reason why we see this shift from the creator God as this combination of forces in a kind of pagan sense, where you'll have multiple different entities that are born of a consummation. So in a more pagan polytheistic religion, the creators are usually a male and a female god who consummate to create all the lower gods, right? You have Kronos and Gaia, whatever. And actually, that might not be the exact pairing, but you know what I mean.
Yeah, I know. Yeah.
You have Zeus and Hera, or whatever it is.
Yeah. Whoever
in the
they
pantheon,
are,
right?
Yeah.
And this creation of a monotheistic God is a creator God who has not ever been created. He's just is. And he's outside of nature, right? So if you're making a God that is like eternal and outside of nature, you wouldn't place him within like the organic or the evident kind of ways in which things come to be. That is the way in which paganism arises, right? So I think that in some senses leads to this, fixation basically in the Old Testament with patriline. So that's another thing that shifts. In these biblical texts, you end up with just paragraphs after paragraphs of, okay, this is Abraham and all of his sons, and then, his sons had these sons and they were kings, and then here we are all the way down at, Jesus.
Yeah.
Here we are at Jesus. So and this is something I've actually talked about with Bard, because I've always been very fascinated by lineage, and in class Brett and Heather have this concept called lineage selection, which is actually kind of runs against some of the population level kind of ways of learning or thinking, group selection models for thinking about evolution, right? So they have this theory, they're like lineage selection. And so I've always kind of had this in mind, that I want a powerful lineage. I'm interested in having a nice big lineage, right? Like I want to have kids. I want to see them come into the world. I want to see them be successful. So I've always kind of had that orientation in my thinking. But when I brought this up to Bard, he was like, well, men are interested in lineage, not women. Right?
Yeah.
And that stopped me. I was like, what does that mean exactly? And I've been metabolizing this over time to kind of think about what that actually means. And I think he's right in a sense of, he talks a lot about the socion, which is this kind of ideal kind of tribe of prehistory. And from that vantage point, the woman knows who her children are. She doesn't need to know who the man was. She doesn't need to be concerned about the patriline, right, or the purity of that line, because she has this knowledge, because she gave birth, of who her children are. Whereas the father does not have that certainty of paternity, right?
Yeah.
He has to trust that the child he's investing in is the child that his genetics are actually stored within. And when you get the invention of property, when you have tribes that end up with, let's say, herds of animals, or once sedentary kind of agricultural behavior takes hold, you have stores of property or grain. The question of who inherits all of this becomes important for the man, because he's the one producing most of this, right? The women are in the inner circle, the men are in the outer circle. The women are, taking care of that which is internal to the community, to the tribe, and the men are kind of building their wealth on the outsides. And if you have a bunch of cattle and you're looking and you're trying to figure out, well, who do I give this cattle to if I die? You need to know who's in your patriline, who are your sons. And you don't know that for sure unless you create some sort of social architecture to ensure that that is the case. And so there becomes a deal. There's like an arrangement between men and women that occurs where women are like, okay, in exchange for your protection and, you know, your delivery of things to me, I will reward myself exclusively to you. Then you can know that these are your children and not someone else's children. And the men also reinforce these things towards one another. So you also see this in the Bible. There are like moments when men from another group like have sex with, you know, the daughter of one of these patriarchs, and all of her brothers end up killing these guys. You know, so you end up with these kind of honor cultures as well, because you have to preserve the integrity of the social system. And if you have defectors, if you have people that break, you know, these rules, then they get the wrath of the patriarchs kind of coming down upon them. So I feel like the patriline and the certainty of paternity and this basic kind of asymmetry between men and women, where women know who their children are, where they are in their cycle as well. Women know what's going on with them and their bodies, but men don't. And this asymmetry, I think, also is a kind of ripe dimension for deception, for cheating, for these kinds of, you know, almost warring tactics between the sexes, for one to get more out of the other than the other wants to give. So those are all kind of entangled in those stories, the story of Adam and Eve and the Old Testament. I've been reading the Bible, so like all of this stuff.
Oh wait, recently?
Oh yeah, I read it every week. Every week I go to Bible study. Yeah, I'm running a group we've been reading the Old Testament and the New Testament as well for months now.
Yeah, like this is like blowing my mind. Is like, I'm like, what? Like who is Raven? It's like, really, you go into Bible study? Because like I see you, you're like this, like I don't know. So you're like this, like you're like dark. You're into like the industrial stuff. You're like, you know, this radical, and you're like, oh yeah, I lead a Bible study every week.
I lead a Bible study group.
So yeah, I mean, I very much like to hear like, so what is the underlying thought about leading this? Like, is this something that you're personally interested in, maybe philosophically or spiritually, or where is this coming from?
Well, I mean, I think I'm just primarily interested in literacy at some point. I want to understand the rise and fall of my civilization and its similarities and differences to different civilizations who were based on different kinds of sacred texts and also from different periods of history. So, I mean, this idea of God is different, you know, this monotheistic God, this eternal creator God that is outside, that is transcendent, that's beyond nature, that is everlasting and never changing. All of these qualities are different than the way in which the pagan cosmology of where good and evil was all created in the beginning of time. You know, it was all created at the origin, and you could live in a world where there was both good and evil, and that was all created by the gods. And the gods didn't really care about humans. You know, they were kind of fickle, and they were arguing amongst themselves quite often. And sometimes they would come down to earth and have sex with a woman. And like, you know, there were all sorts of different kinds of things that the gods would do and I mean, a lot of this from an evolutionary perspective, you can see was functional, right? You had certain kinds of phenomena going on in your environment. How do you explain it? How do you talk about it? Why do we harvest all of our crops on this day? Well, this was the day that Persephone went down into Hades, you know, because Hades stole her from the field. And so on this day, we harvest all of our foods because the winter's coming, you know, whatever. So those mythologies ended up creating structures of coordination for people within communities. And they worked for quite a while. But there was also this dynamic where if you were worshiping a certain god, let's say you were really into Persephone or some specific kind of god, or Baal or whatever, like you're a warring tribe. You have a bunch of gods in your pantheon, but there's this one specific god that you're almost a cult of that god.
Yeah.
You know, if you're conquered by another people, you have to give up your god because your god didn't win. Your god didn't do what he needed to do or what she needed to do to protect you from the rival group's gods. And you had to assimilate, or you were, you know, murdered or whatever. Right. So there's this process where, or integrated. There was also integration that would happen. So you would see that you'd have two people come together, two peoples, and there would then be the creation of like a father god that gave birth to, you know, or father and mother god who gave birth to these two gods that were like the prominent gods of these two different tribes, right? So there was a way of unifying this whole group. But there was a process where whoever lost in these battles ended up being kind of subsumed into the dominant culture, or in a very literal sense, like the culture that dominated, that had the technology or the resources or the capability of overpowering the resources and capabilities of another group. And the thing about the Israelites is that they end up getting kicked out and beaten and dominated over and over and over and over again, but they do not lose their God.
Exactly.
They keep their God. They keep their God. And how do they do that? Right? Like that is a fascinating question. How do they end up keeping their God after all of these periods where they end up conquered or kicked out of Babylon or whatever, people trying to come after them and exterminate them? Like these things have happened recurringly. And they happen over and over again in the stories of the Old Testament. And yet by the time you get to the end, you know, they still have, you know, they still have their God, they still have their text. And so I think that there's something quite fascinating going on in that period of time of the Old Testament. And it ends up being the groundwork that, so you have the Old Testament, and then you have kind of Plato and Aristotle in Greece, and you have later on, of course, the New Testament. Jesus, right? This triad is very like powerful underpinning for Western civilization. And I want to know about it directly, right? I want to read it and think about it and understand it from my own vantage point, rather than, of course, just like, you know, the kind of dismissive attitude that most people have towards religion or religious belief. Yeah, I'm not interested in being stopped from being curious about the religious perspective or like the underpinnings of society when it comes to religion, just because it's, you know, archaic.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, like, just to go on that, it's interesting this is coming up because I just was having a conversation recently with some people in the Intellect Discord, and we were talking about how, like, I specifically brought up one of my my last episode that I just released with evolutionary astrologer Simon, and I also talked with Uber Boyo. And the thing that, you know, Uber Boyo, for those who are unaware, he's like a Nietzschean, Jungian type of YouTuber, very entertaining. But what they both had in common was they both saw the last 2,000 years. You could look at it as like the age of Pisces in the astrological sense, or as Uber Boyo calls it, the age of Christ or religion. You know, very much there's a parallel there with Christ represented as the fish of Pisces. And that what happened was, in this previous age, the previous 2,000 years, the age of Pisces, it was like everyone was supposed to align with a god. They were supposed to look above and align with a universal truth, with a god, with a single truth. And what this did was this created sort of like a Manichaean dynamic. Now, all the, you know, Christianity, Manichaeism, it all, you know, came about at around the same time, around 2,000 years ago. And we're just transitioning out of it very recently into the age of Aquarius, which is very new agey. But I mean, this is something that a lot of people, you know, with esoterics, astrologers, all sorts of different people of different affiliations are all kind of like converging on. But what happened before that, as you mentioned before, it was like, before this age of Pisces, people were much more open. This polytheistic nature, you know, it was more pluralistic. And specifically what's had to do with what we're talking about is how the Christians and the Muslims, how they went down a particular path of like this dualistic nature, oppositional of good and evil, and how this good and evil dynamic actually helped them politicize good and evil, and how this mobilized, Christianity and Islam are the two world religions with the highest amount of adherents, and also why they have the most amount of religious wars. And what happened later in the modern age was basically this good and evil manichaeistic dynamic was secularized. And then this translated, and what happened in my interpretation is what's happening with the meta crisis after postmodernism is basically with the decentralization of power, the 60s, the internet, social media, this manichaeistic dynamic that was weaponized against the masses by the elites, first in the pre-modern age, by the sovereign and the priest class, by the modern age nation state with the scientist class. Now, what's happening is each of us is now, weaponizing this dualistic dynamic against each other, which is why we're like all warring with each other. And how this ties into Judaism is because people have this monolithic view that Judaism is this, monolithically monotheist religion, right? Like Christianity and Islam. But actually, if you go back to the origins of Judaism, they talked about El and Elohim. They talk about gods. They didn't just talk about one God. And what later, through various iterations of the religion, then they converged on that God. They were the chosen people of that God, which may help explain why they've always had him. No matter through all their, exoduses, throughout all the tribulations they've gone through, they always had that one God, because it's coming from a history where that was the one of many. That was the one God of which, they were chosen, which may explain why they held on to that God, and also may explain why they never fell into the manichaeistic dynamics of later Abrahamic religions. So that's my personal interpretation of why things may have played out the way they did. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's interesting. So can you explain to me what you mean when you say Manichaeism?
So Manichaeism. So basically, it emerged. I forget the exact history, but basically, it emerged around like the 2nd or 3rd century CE, out of the Middle East, and it was basically the first major world religion that really instantiated the concept of like good and evil. Because before that, like with Judaism and with like early Christianity with the Gnostics, like Gnostics were all about knowledge. And even they were like, the Gnostics, they believed that the God that the Jews worshipped, right? Yalda Ba'oth, he was the false God. And then there was the real God, So like the early Christians, they're in a sense polytheistic. And they're like, the Jews, you're worshiping the wrong God. And the Jews themselves, the early Jews, they were polytheistic. And they're like, oh, this is our God. But later it just become, it's like, we are the chosen people. This is our God. And then the Christians ran with it, and they're like, oh, there must be only one God because we're coming from Judaism, right? Judaism says there's only one God. No, Judaism actually was like, no, there are many gods, and we just chose this one. And gradually it just became, okay, that's the only God there is because we're the chosen people. No one else is chosen, right? So in the Manichaeism in a broader, more general colloquial sense became to mean basically good and evil. And the thing, like, for example, in Christianity, they had the concept of hell. And I'm no scholar of Judaism, but they don't have a hell, and
they don't
like
even have an afterlife.
Yeah, exactly. And it's just like, yeah, I mean, Jews, and so that's why, like, in the Old Testament, I mean, God acts like an asshole. He does a lot of asshole. Like, God acts like an asshole a lot of times in the Old Testament, and and he kind of manipulates human beings, and like there wasn't this dualistic sense. There are like some superheroes that are good, and then there are villains that are evil. It was just like, it's all the same thing, very much like the Greek mythology. It just like morality wasn't really put into it like that. There was something that you follow, but it wasn't necessarily, good versus evil. But it was a Christianity, Manichaeism, all that after. That's when good and evil happened. And that's what's able to, from my interpretation, is how they're able to mobilize, they're able to politicize their religion and get people converted and get, like, nations, theocracies created, right? So that's just my interpretation of that.
Interesting. Yeah. Well, I think Manichaeism in that sense also has its roots in Zoroastrianism.
Yes, Bard. Yeah, Bard is very familiar with that.
Yeah, which I haven't actually heard him talk that much about this, the splitting of the world rather than it being like substance and essence. There's all sorts of ways to create a dualism. The dualism is good and evil within Zoroastrianism. And then I guess this is picked up by Christianity. But it's interesting because in some sense, a lot of what we think of as being Christian, like the concept of hell, well, where does hell isn't mentioned really, like in the New Testament. It's like, it's not like a fully fledged concept. You could point to places where you're like, oh, well, he's kind of where do the rich people go if they don't go to heaven when they die, right? Like, okay, so what's that, and then Revelation, which I haven't got to yet, but I think Revelation kind of gives you this portrait of what hell could be. But I think Dante's Inferno really was what popularized the notion of hell.
Yeah.
And also because there was such a widespread institutionalization of like Roman Catholicism, the priests kind of decided what the interpretation of certain things were at any given time, and they popularized those ideas. So a lot of it you have to trace through this like lineage of Roman Catholicism itself and how they actually brought these ideas of what these interpretations are to the kind of collective thinking of Europe. And then also, of course, there is all the work that philosophers did or theologians kind of outside of the church itself on working through these ideas. Like a lot of philosophers were interested in contacting God. A lot of scientists were interested in contacting God. So there's a lot of our understanding of who God is that's also very rooted in Plato, like the kind of Plato concept of reality, of like this kind of the table, right? Like the Platonic form of the
realm of forms,
this like other world where everything is that's perfect. It's also kind of noumenal, right? We get that with Kant, this kind of entirely withdrawn place that we can never have access to. That is the perfect realm that has this Gnosticism to it, right? We can get there if we die, which is like very much a kind of death drive orientation. If we die, we get to be in the perfect place, but here in this world, this is the evil place, and it's dirty, and we have to cleanse it, right? So I think like it's interesting to disentangle all of these religions and what motivated or what caused certain kinds of behavior, because in some sense, like you were talking about like conversion. So conversion is a kind of like mechanism for growing your religion. It popularizes your religion. So what is the barrier to people for conversion? What's the bar at absolute, right? Well, for Judaism, it's excruciating. Like you're not going to get in easily.
Yeah, you gotta like knock out. You gotta be like knocking on the door like 10,000 times. Yeah, finally they're like, okay, maybe.
And they even had these concepts like kind of written into the way that the temples were designed, where there were these layers where there was the place in the temple that everybody was. All the Israelites, all the Jewish people could be, but then as you go kind of in closer and closer to the center, fewer and fewer people basically to the point where you have like the oldest or the most senior rabbi, who's the only one who can get to the center, right? So there's this kind of process of moving through space that eliminates people and relationship to how close they are to the divine truth. And I think that like in Christianity, you have this conversion imperative, right? You have to take a whole entire empire and convert them to this new religion. And the idea is that if you accept Jesus Christ as the Messiah figure who dies on the cross for the sins of man, then you can begin to, worship, and you can be considered a Christian. And that as a mechanism, was really, it's really effective. It's even more effective today. I think, you had to be baptized previously. And I think that there was a bit of a process there, but now it's like, all you have to do is accept Jesus and you're good, right? Like there's this idea that you can kind of have cheap access to religious cleansing. And I think that's kind of trite. Like, yes, there are ways in which these things have become popular, almost like plastic toys. You know, they're kind of like these representations of themselves that they kind of reference the origin. They kind of look like the thing that it is, but it's actually not that thing. And if you stop there, if you like look at the evangelicals and you're like, oh, that's what Christianity is, it's like, well, no,
Not quite.
not quite. There's actually quite a lot of going on here. And I don't know, my view is, and it's kind of interesting, this, I guess, this like cosmology that you brought forth, this like, you know, the age of Pisces, right?
Yeah.
And moving to the age of Aquarius, and there having been a kind of way that we understood the world in the West, let's say, or more broadly, kind of the Middle East, Abrahamic kind of branching that produced this reality. And now that reality is no longer working. And in the ashes will arise, you know, maybe a new Messiah, who knows, who will kind of like guide or potentially create the possibility of exodus from this decaying structure into the future, where we can have new systems of organization and new religious structures. Whether or not we get out of religion, I'm very skeptical about. I don't think that we're going to transcend the religious nature of humanity, which is another reason why I've been getting into these texts, because I'm curious about, from an evolutionary perspective, how did they organize people? How did these things arise? How did they work, right? Like in Judaism, the law is almost synonymous with God. I mean, the 10 Commandments. And the thing of it is, when you violate the 10 Commandments, you end up committing a sin, and the wrath of God, his jealousy, his anger, you know, all of those things that you talked about, comes down upon you as punishment. And it's deserved punishment because you sinned against the commandments. And God, in some sense, is judgment. You know, he will punish you if you don't behave in accordance with the divine law. And, you know, the law is something in and of itself that has strong resonance even today. I think part of what we're dealing with now, kind of going back to where we started, what is the law? What is it to behave in a lawful manner? Is there any sanctity in the law? Like, what is the role of the state for preserving the sanctity of the law? And what happens when the law no longer represents the moral high ground? Like, what happens? Well, Jesus comes in and he flips everything over, right? Like, that's exactly what happens between the Old and the New Testament. Is Jesus is like, look, these laws are no longer sacred because the people who are observing these laws are still corrupted. They're still sinning, even though they follow the rules. And so the rules are the problem, right? So, you know, he goes in and he flips over the tables and the money changers in the temple. He tells parables and stories where the hierarchies are flipped. The poor man will get into heaven before a rich man. That totally reverses the sense of hierarchy that people are expecting from the divine order that they've accepted in their reality. So in that sense, Jesus is kind of, I think of him as this kind of like fool or trickster character, where he takes the prescribed or like the expected notions of reality and he turns them. And he leaves people kind of in this wake of chaos. But in doing so, he reveals that things are not as they seem. And of course, he also ends up being the point for salvation, which not every fool does that, and that's what makes him a messiah rather than just a fool. But you know,
I mean, like there's so much there, and specifically you're talking about the law. If anyone goes on Twitter right now, they're getting limbically hijacked like a motherfucker right now, because it's crazy right now. But one of the few videos I did watch on Twitter was, I believe, a Republican representative talking with these pro-Trump supporters, and he was like, "I'm with you," all that blah blah blah. But like, look, the law is the law, right? And like one parallel I see is like what this uprising, this insurgency, possibly you can say, is that again, like when I spoke with my evolutionary astrologer friend, he was talking about how like we're talking about the law, again, God, whether this universal truth, whether that's the one monotheistic God, whether that's the modern rationalist paradigm of the scientific truth, given to you by the new priest class, was a scientist. Or it could be, this monolithic government who tells you, hey, these are the rules, you follow them. All of these are being turned upside down, and what we're moving to right now is what we have to do is we have to be able to accept each other's truths. The Age of Aquarius, which is, instead of looking above, it's a network. It's, the individual truths of each person. It's returning back to the polytheistic age. It's where so again, like, it's like this whole thing is being turned upside down and possibly return, and going back to maybe returning to a more cyclical nature, a more feminine nature, a more feminine relationship with reality. Actually, and what I wanted to get into, and which is, again, like, we're talking about religion, we're talking about astrology. I saw you tweet about the Great Conjunction and the winter solstice, and this very much goes with what we're talking about. I don't know your particular thoughts on that, and I also saw you another thing. You're referencing the Hermetics podcast, which I love, and that you're so good. And you're reading a book on precognition and retrocausality. And like, look, I'm not surprised that, we're all starting to get into this stuff. I was like, evolutionary astrology. I was like, why the hell would I even do that? But I was like, my friend told me, hey, talk to them. I was like, okay, I'll talk with them. I just finished a book on Jung's synchronicity about, acausality. And like, we're going into all these different things. And like, in this meta crisis, we just have to break down these old paradigms and get into the new. And I mean, the string that's running through all this, and which I saw some resonance between your path and my path, is that you actually did not start off as a philosopher, quote unquote. You didn't even really plan out to be an evolutionary biologist in college. You actually started out as a film and performing arts major. So I just this wide diverging, I guess you could say, mycelial path or rhizomatic path that you're taking on is, I find a lot of resonance to that. So I was just wondering, like what is your common thread through all this, and like, where do you see yourself diverging off into now? Very curious about that.
Sure, yeah. I think what I'm kind of beginning to understand is there is this returning to the creation of ritual or new ritual, or new religion, maybe, that I find myself coming to. And I think that that's part of why I'm so fascinated by Alexander Bard's work and syntheism in particular, because it really represents a attempt to create a comprehensive, coherent religion that's built off of emerging trends. Like, it's not totally off base. Most new religions aren't like totally coming out of nowhere. They usually arise from certain kinds of qualities or movements in the culture, and are kind of emerging out of those memes, I guess, or operating systems, whatever you want to say. And I think that, like, being someone who's interested in aesthetics, this also relates to my interest in ontological design, that there is design qualities of the world of existence, and building things or creating your environment, and being very intentional and responsive to how things change when you manipulate them, and the creation of these worlds, essentially. So creating worlds as being one of the fundamental things that any organism does, right? So there's this process in life where niches create organisms and organisms create niches, right? A niche is a world. A niche is a place where an organism can make that niche its world. It can create a morphology that is nested within the qualities of that specific niche. And when that niche is gone, your morphology is suddenly obsolete, right?
Yes, yeah.
And you are threatened, right? So on some level, I feel like technological progress has brought us more problems probably than it really has brought solutions. And it's also given us a sense of what it means to be human that I think is disconnected from reality. And the reconnecting to our evolutionary history allows for us to see our continuity with our historical selves, and also be wary of what that means. Human beings are not the most docile of creatures. And that's a meaningful thing. That's a meaningful aspect of our behavior and existence. And all the qualities that arise out of human beings need to be accounted for. And so I think that there's, starting with this idea of like creating environments. I've also been very interested in architecture or interior design. I'm a carpenter by trade.
Yeah,
and
that's very
so,
interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, and so like just building and creating things in the world, like in the tangible real world. This is another way in which Rachel Haywire and I connected, was we both love architecture, right? So I walk into a city and I'm just like, oh my God, and just in rapture by the way in which the environment creates my experience. And I think that this moves into ontological design very well, because we're in an experience economy. You're providing an experience for me as your guest on your show. We're also together collectively providing an experience for the audience that ends up watching this, which is then kind of part of what becomes your brand, which is your broader kind of experience that you provide for people online. And so we're really in an experience economy. And I think that that's also what metamodernism points out, right? The metamodern move is like people basically creating services for one another in order to learn and grow and create new kinds of worlds. So all of these things are entangled. And of course, the ontological design perspective, as it's connected to UX, user experience, points out that technology is kind of the super tool for designing experience, right? So we're seeing that, right? We're seeing a kind of crude execution of experience design with the way that limbic hijacking works, social media works, and we're seeing how these loops, the tool, we make the tool and then the tool makes us. Even with this LARPing escapade at the Capitol, I mean, this is kind of indicative of the fact that there are a bunch of like very online right-wingers on these forums getting themselves hyped up about these ideas, totally disconnected from the rest of us in reality. And they have a kind of mythos in their head about what's happening, and they act on those impulses. And that type of pattern recognition that's happening, it's almost like a kind of free association state where we're just trying to recognize some semblance of meaningful pattern using a lot of tools like synchronicity, right? Because we were total information overload, right? And then that becomes a design framework. It becomes a design problem. How do we design these worlds for people? And of course, that's what, there's been an algorithm for that. There's got an algorithm for that. And it's not about human flourishing. It's about maximizing time on screen, right? So that's kind of a crude way of, for many people, organizing things and allowing for their bubbles to arise. And we see what that looks like. It's not great. It's not a great life for people. I wouldn't prescribe it. But I think that in terms of thinking about the integration between like a technologically advanced world and people who are technologically advanced, like I think we're seeing a clash where we don't have people who are technologically advanced. We have technology that's technologically advanced, and we have people
they're kind of way behind. Yeah,
and we're just like way behind in that. So what does the integration of these things look like? How do we become technologically literate? How do we understand the medium that we're now within, and how do we become designers of it in and of itself?
Exactly.
And that kind of putting you in the position of the agent. I think that you're right in the sense that we're moving into an era of pluralism where we're going to have to essentially be able to deal with the stranger. We're going to have to re-examine what in-group and out-group means, because if we're going to live in a truly pluralistic world, we have to be able to treat the out-group with respect.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
We don't know how to do that. We think of them as being some sort of evil entity. And some of them you do have to, like, you can't only just treat an outgroup with respect, because some outgroups will be out to get you, right? And this is, our ancestors figured this stuff out amongst themselves because they were living in times where there was no clearly superior group, and there was a lot of skirmishes between groups because there was an expansionist power that started to try and take over another smaller group, and they fought back. And, there were all of this tensions between multiple powers, and it creates a lot of violence, And so I think there's also, I think that we're going to keep seeing violence. We're going to see it, and tension between all of these different realities. And the thing I've been thinking about, actually, I had this thought, I think yesterday.
All right, let's hear it.
I was like, okay, so when it comes to people having different political beliefs than me, people kind of operating from different implicit kind of metaphysical positions, all of this kind of diversity of opinion, I'm going to treat it as if I'm interacting with somebody who's of a different religion than me. And when I thought about that, I was like, okay, so it's different. It's not, I'm going to argue about the ideas with you. We're not in that space anymore. If we ever were. You know, this is the way that the things that people believe are more than just thoughts that they have in their heads. This is a whole complex. It's a whole set of identities, a whole set of loyalty to your group. So you end up with aesthetic signaling. You end up with a high amount of emotional investment in the things that you believe. And trying to find coherency, trying to be like, oh, well, these two thoughts that you just said, these are not coherent. These aren't logically connected. Can you please make this connection for me? Like, what about this historical event? Like, honestly, I think that matters increasingly less for most interactions.
Yeah, absolutely.
And what it is you're like, no, you're a person who believes that you have the one true God. I'm a person who believes that I have the one true God.
Yeah, exactly.
And we don't believe that we have the same God.
Yeah.
So we basically have to learn how to interact with each other through a system of etiquette, right? And so etiquette becomes necessary. And it's funny because I think in a lot of left-wing kind of communities, there's been this total destruction of etiquette. You know, I would even say that like the radical honesty thing is kind of at the core of what that is. It's like, that is to say, you're trying to drive yourself towards authenticity. And authenticity and etiquette are kind of not the same thing, right?
Yeah, you're right.
You only get to authenticity as etiquette through like a meta portal, where you're like, you basically realize that there's a sense of discontinuity between the inside and the outside, and these two people in relationship with one another, and that because of that, there's like a mediator that needs to be created, and the mediator is the etiquette. And people kind of, I think, naturally, when they try and be tolerant towards one another, but they want to also hold the difference of their opinion, their difference of their belief, these things naturally arise. And these systems of etiquette, we've pretty much dismantled them.
Yeah, pretty much.
You know, it used to be that you didn't talk about, what was it, sex, death, religion, and politics.
Yeah.
You know, you didn't talk about those things with people in your family, or, you know, when you went to a party, you know, because they were known to cause tensions and problems. And so instead you groomed each other, right? Like social grooming is about kind of exchange of compliments, and compliments not just like, oh, Albert, you look so wonderful today.
Oh, thank you, Raven. Same to you. Oh my God. Your hair is just fabulous.
So there's that, but compliment as in complementarity, as in where are we coherent? Where do we have the same view? Like, well, people talking about their kids is like a place where, yeah, if you're Muslim and I'm Christian, whatever, like we can still talk about our kids and how well they're doing in school. Or we can still talk about, you know, XYZ thing, but we're not going to get a theological debate about whose God is, or whose scripture, or like who's the true Messiah. Like, that's not where we're going, because we're just trying to have a calm and collected experience where bonding can occur while also heterogeneity is maintained.
Yeah.
And that's tricky, because there's this like desire to flatten everything and to remove all the boundaries, and that basically creates a homogeneous substrate. So how do you deal with heterogeneity? How do you deal with difference between groups, but also the necessity for people to live alongside one another in a truly pluralistic, cosmopolitan society? And I think that's a big question, but it's not like we don't have examples of this. Like, people have done this before. And I think this is why Bard is particularly interested in the Persian Empire, because they actually maintained a cosmopolitan, multicultural, multi-religious empire without ending up falling into any of these traps. And I think there's a lot to be seen there. Also, Lebanon, before it broke into religious violence, was like a place, like the Middle East actually has at some points gotten to these places of equilibrium with Christians, Jews, and Muslims. And there's a lot to learn from those periods of time. There's also a lot to learn from when they collapse and under what conditions.
Yeah, that's a lot, and like, wow, it's like that's why like I feel like what I'm doing with Noetic Nomads is like I'm trying to be that bridge. I'm trying to be like, so I don't know if you see my little interactions with everyone. I'm like, hey, everyone, if you see my tweets, oh, I love you. Like I'm trying to like transmit this love to everyone, and like whenever someone comes to my Discord, I give them a big welcome and I give them a big hug. I give them all the likes and the hearts. Whatever they post, I'm like, that's what I'm trying to do with my own thing. And I mean, I guess maybe like I'm just very curious about like, because I know like you're very in tune with like the dynamics of like the masculine and the feminine, the archetypes, and like, how do you see me personifying these archetypes? I'm very curious because when I look at myself, I'm like, I'm kind of like here and I'm kind of like there. So I'm just curious. And you yourself maybe like having your own set of dynamics with the masculine and feminine. I'm just curious about like how you see my coming off.
Yeah. Well, Cat just came here.
Oh my God. Yes. Cameo. Yeah. Put him on cam.
Well, you're a big personality. You know that, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I gotta. Yeah. I'm just my gift. Yeah. Yeah.
And you know, bold. I would say like I don't know if you're from New Jersey, but like that tracks. Like
oh, yeah.
if you are,
grew up
like,
here. Yeah. Definitely. Yeah.
That tracks for me because I have a roommate who's also from New Jersey.
Ooh, yeah.
He's
Jersey represent.
Like,
cool.
Big, bold,
yeah.
and like very kind of like I would almost say flirtatious with like
really?
everyone.
Oh, okay, cool.
You know, there's a gregariousness I think that I've noticed from people from New Jersey, and I would characterize you as being very gregarious and being very almost like outrageous, like in a sense you play the fool, like you kind of play this fool character, in order to, I think, make people feel comfortable, to kind of like shatter their seriousness. I really appreciate that within this space specifically because the aesthetic is like very serious. And,
yes.
You know, I think people when they get into things like X risk and, you know, Sensemaking, it's like put on your monocle, like
monocle emoji,
like what's going on, and like everybody's like very solemn, and there's like this kind of intensity that can come with. I mean, obviously, the subjects are serious subjects, but I think it leads to a kind of asymmetry of experience that people are left wanting to laugh and to enjoy themselves. I mean, and I think that that's something I also appreciate about Peter is that while he's dives into all of these like dark subjects, he also cracks crude jokes and
stoic daddy.
He like does his stoic daddy thing. So, you know, I think that humor, you know, humor has its own kind of aesthetics and properties, and it's a beautiful way of kind of creating a system of signals that is both inviting and also kind of pointing at either like hypocrisies or at kind of like making fun of oneself or making fun of one's content in some sense, like, or the seriousness of things. I think that can be quite nice. It's like, yes, here we are, we're trying to dive into these serious topics, but also like, I'm a fool, you're a fool, we're all fools.
Exactly.
Like, what are we even trying to do here, right? Like, if we think of ourselves as being too important, we've already lost sight of what we're doing. And it's very easy when you're thinking important things, you know, to think of yourself as being like really important. I'm so important. My ideas are so important. Everybody should listen to me. It's like, well, is that really the case? Like, I don't know. Like, be humble, man. You know, and I think that that's what I get from you is like a lot of just like playful and kind of trickster, humorous character who's not afraid to like step into also like I would say kind of an American aesthetic, like the game show aesthetic.
Yeah.
Very
Yeah.
like American kind
Yeah.
of like celebrity or like trash television kind of thing. So I think there's also like a
Yeah.
lowbrow, highbrow thing going
Yeah.
on, which I really like.
Thank you. Thank
Um,
you.
so I don't know. And then for you in terms of like masculine or feminine, I feel like I do see you in a kind of androgynous way, or and not in the sense
Mm.
that you're like desexualized, but like that you have kind of these mergings of
Yeah, like
characteristics.
yeah, they're both like this. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I see
Yeah,
that.
because
Yeah.
like the warmth, kind of like the warming maternal kind of feeling and being really affectionate and like openly caring is like considered to be more of like that motherly feeling. But you could also consider that to be like a kind of brotherly love, that you're like extending a kind of brotherly
Mm.
love to people, like a sibling kind of notion towards those who are brought into your group to make sure that they feel welcome. That kind of behavior, very non-rivalrous, right? It's very much to
Yeah.
like put yourself in a kind of humbling position and to welcome others and uplift others. And I think that runs contrary to some ideas about what masculinity is. But you also are like also very male.
Yeah. Yeah.
You're like bodybuilding dude.
Yeah. Yeah. Cause yeah, I'm just, yeah, I see myself as like embodying, like, I'm very masculine and I'm very feminine. And like when you say like I'm kind of like an androgen, but not like I'm in like a middle ground,
Yeah.
as in like I'm here and I'm here. And like when you add them together, I'm kind of like over here. So
Sure.
yeah, so I mean, like, thank you so much. I really appreciate that, especially coming from you. I know you're very much into aesthetics. I like how you call me a game show host and like trash TV. Like, I take that as a compliment. Like, I love that. And I would actually like, I'm very much okay. Let me talk about your aesthetic, because okay, so let's talk about this. Okay, I can be honest, Raven, you scare the hell out of me. For a long time, one of the reasons why I was like, I'd be honestly more comfortable like interviewing Elon Musk than talking to you, because you're like, oh my God, Raven's so smart. And she's like all like dark. And I don't know. I think she's good. I'm like really scared of her. Like she's very like, I don't know, gothy and like into darkness and death and all that stuff. But but also it's kind of like when I like actually like, like interact with you and like I see your other like, like conversations, interactions, you're like, hey, I'm Raven. I'm like this. And I see this light. I'm like, wait a minute, where's this coming from? I see this brightness, this sparkiness, even girlishness, energetic. It's very youthful to me. And I'm like, this kind of like, but then there's also this, and how like, I know like you grew up in Olympia. They're kind of like, very much, I don't know, again, radical, anarchist and all that, like very, very punk and all that stuff. But I see this like this. And it's kind of like with me as well. If you just saw me walking down the street or something, like I don't know, I could be like a dude bro. But hey, I mean, if we ever talk, like I give you a big hug. I mean, like, I'm a vegan, I'm a virgin, I'm really weird, right? So it's just like, it's kind of all weird. So I'm just curious about like how you yourself, like how do you see yourself as like your aesthetic, your expression, your performance? Because like to me, like I'm putting on performance right now, but it's all, but it's also part of me. This is also like one of my many personae. Like, I don't know, I'm just curious about how you see yourself expressing yourself and your presentation to the world and how you see yourself.
Yeah, that's a big question. I think I've
I'm
been
sorry
moving
about
through.
that.
Yeah, I mean, I've been going through kind of a metamorphosis. Like, if you like, you can see from my Stoa videos, like how my hair has changed.
Yes, I've definitely noticed it. Yeah.
Because like I used to have like a really intense, edgy kind of goth look, and ultimately it was just like a lot of maintenance to keep it up. And also I realized that it was kind of intimidating.
Like I just admitted, yeah.
And I think I already come off as intimidating to people, even without having a really intense look that's actually kind of designed to be intimidating. I've definitely leaned on that as a aesthetic dimension, being kind of almost scary in terms of how I present myself, and kind of displaying, my like affinity for dark and serious things as a way of filtering people, basically, who talk to me on some level. And I think personally, that had a lot to do with just being young and not really knowing how to handle a lot of attention. And like, I mean, young women just are like, deal with a lot of like attention. And my way of like dealing with that was just like looking really intense and like people not talking to me because of that. And it largely works, but also doesn't. I mean, I go out to the store or like whatever, and people just talk to me, right? And I just talk to people. Like, I'm very extroverted. I love interacting with strangers. I love interacting with strangers, like people that I'm only ever going to exchange a sentence with or whatever. It's like, it's part of what I enjoy about living in a city or living in a society is these kind of like small exchanges. And I feel like my look never really stopped people really that much.
They saw it. You can't fool us too long.
I can't fool them.
Yeah.
No, it was only people who, you know, there's a kind of pretension of like going to parties and, you know, wanting to look a certain way and wanting to attract a certain kind of person and all of that, that I think those things actually ended up working. So it was more like in my peer group and within the realm of like acquaintances that I think that I was really mobilizing my aesthetic for those kinds of purposes. But, you know, a lot of it is also retrospective. Like, on some level, you're attracted to the presentation that you're attracted to, and you express it, and then you only realize through leaving it behind what it was doing for you. And I think now I'm interested in maturing. I'm interested in presenting myself as like a grown woman. And that is causing me to look towards different kinds of aesthetic presentations, certain kinds of ways in which I would like to talk, or certain types of things I'd like to talk about. That's something I've been thinking a lot about in terms of being online, because your signifiers, the things that you say online and the how you talk, all of that becomes essentially your clothes. It becomes what you're wearing. It becomes your display. And I've been thinking about, okay, well, what are the things that I want to talk about publicly, and what are the things that I don't want to talk about publicly? And I think in some sense, this is related to my understanding of like the public versus the private, and like what are the things that I'm holding sacred, or what are the things that I just don't think are other people's business, you know, or that I don't have any business talking to other people about. So I'm trying to sort those things out, and I think that does relate to the aesthetic dimension for me. And it's because I am questioning this kind of exposure society, right? Like this massive kind of like expose. There's a literal kind of exposure where people just like are literally taking their clothes off.
OnlyFans.
I mean, and or just like people just posting pictures of themselves like on their Twitters. Like it's there's really a lot of that, or like there's a vulnerability kind of exposure where you talk about your feelings in a really intimate way, or you talk about sexual experiences in a really intimate way, and you just publicize it all. I mean, this is probably more dispositional than anything, and I really shouldn't make it into any kind of like larger socio or like political point, but I think there's a reservation that I have just as a person towards certain types of like intimate knowledge. And so I don't feel particularly comfortable with just like vulnerability posting on Twitter, because it's a public forum. I don't know who's going to read it. Like, it doesn't feel good to me to do that type of thing. I can be like, well, this is what people should do, but you know, I don't know that that's actually the case, but it does seem to be a phenomenon. And I think it's actually been something that's kept me out of social media in my life in general, is that this was like what people did. This was the trend. Instagram, expose your life. Facebook, expose your life. You know, I didn't like doing any of those things, so I left both of those platforms and I went to Twitter, because Twitter was like people talking about their ideas. But you know, now I've come to see that there is also a kind of life exposing trend on Twitter, but with certain accounts, certain worlds of certain accounts as well. And so it brings up the question, well, what are the things that I want to share? And I think for me, I'm much more comfortable with sharing my ideas than I am my personal life. But unfortunately, there's also a deep entanglement. I mean, like, for example, I'm interested in marriage and like the revivification of like marriage as an institution. And that obviously entangles in some way with my personal life and my personal beliefs. And I think talking about my personal beliefs could actually help contextualize why marriage is important to me and why I think it's an important thing for other people to consider. just like talking about like polyamory versus monogamy kind of ends up making whoever's talking about it kind of implicit in the conversation. Well, what is your relationship dynamic? What do you think about relationships? Where are you coming from? Yeah, so I don't know whether or not to share some of these things. It's very complicated, and I think it also relates to the kind of attention that you end up getting as well. And I don't know what kind of attention I want to get on some level, because every time like I actually make a tweet and I actually get responses, I have to like I have to engage.
Yeah, I know what that's like right now. It gets overwhelming sometimes.
It can get overwhelming. You're like, oh my God. So like to me, I don't want to agitate people because I don't want to deal with agitation. That's not interesting to me. And I don't know about what other kinds of things, what other kinds of people, or what other kinds of conversations I'd like to be having when I have that public presentation. Whereas here, I feel like I'm talking to you.
It's just Albert. Who's this guy? Who cares?
I know. I'm like, I'm talking to Albert. It's intimate, right? But
yeah.
even though it's going to be posted afterwards, and people are going to see it. It's going to be on the internet for God knows how long.
Interwebs.
Who knows if I'll ever look at it again. I have a tendency to not want to look at the things that I've produced.
Yeah, I know that feel, definitely. But I mean, yeah, I completely get that. And like, like for a long time, like when I'm doing this, right? Like if you were just to be like, watch one of my episodes, be like, oh, Albert, I'm always been some gregarious dude. I spent the last 10 years basically as a hermit. I didn't have any social media. I had almost no interaction with human beings in general. But it's just like going through this whole meta crisis thing, and I'm like, oh my God, there's COVID. And then I was like, I just activated. I was just like, okay, now I'm going. I'm just ready to go. And like, this is how I'm doing it. And I'm going whole hog. You talking about like, I don't know what to share. I'm sharing everything. Do you recall some of the things I've confessed in this conversation? I'm just like, I'm just going. And that's my personal thing. And just like, there's no right or wrong answer. This is how I'm doing it. Peter is very public, and Peter has his own thing right now. It's like, first of all, he's always had his very open letters where he goes deep into his psyche, sends out the daily letter. And then he's like, oh, okay, I'm going to shut it down. No, wait, no, I'm going to steal the culture. It's like, no, I'm going to get a normie job. It's like, oh, no, I'm going to invite everyone tomorrow. Like he goes to this thing that's very public. But now he's kind of like, now he's coming back, and now he's like he's forming boundaries. And that's like one of the things that's been coming up a lot recently. People talk about what kind of boundaries, what kind of membranes, using the biological metaphor, that we need to set up. It can't be fully open, like a semi-permeable. What do we want to let in and what do we not? So yeah, I and that, so again, like that's how I've been doing it. And like what you're talking about before, how it's like, you want to put on this front. I mean, well, I guess I'm projecting because I put on a front. You could call it front, you could call it persona, whatever. Again, like this bodybuilding thing or whatever. It was because I was picked on mercilessly as a kid. I was beat up. This is why I got a tattoo on my arm. Just like, oh, look at me. I wear my tank top. Don't mess with Albert, because if you do, he might, crumble into a little ball and start crying. So I get that. And my friend Monica, in episode number 4 of Noetic Nomads, she was in the art world, right? And, dominated in her circle by males. What she did, she got a super short haircut. And then she would just put on a mean face. It's like, you don't mess with me. And that's what got her through. But now she's like in her 50s now. She's told me like, hey, now I'm just gonna start growing out my ponytail. And be like, hey, this is me, Monica. So it's very interesting. Like again, like these personae that we have to. Well, we don't have to. We choose to, and then all the different personae. Right now, I'm embodying a persona. If I'm talking with my grandmother, I'm not gonna be like this. I'm talking with my mother, I'm not gonna be like this. So yeah. So yeah, I definitely get that, and I love this whole conversation and all the amazing stuff that's happened. So I just want to say thank you for coming on, Raven, and for all the shares. And even if you don't watch it again, I just want to tell you it's been amazing, and I think people will get a lot out of it, whether it's intellectual, whether it's just the craziness, and whether it's just just two people just connecting. So again, thank you. I just love it.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure, and it's been really fun to watch you emerge in this space, and I look forward to all of the other mischief that you're going to get into.
Yes, much mischief, and again, I'm definitely looking forward to everything that's coming from you, Raven. I mean, like, you've been talking with my friend Tia about all kinds of crazy stuff. And I don't know what's gonna happen there, but like what emerges from that,
Yeah,
I'm very excited about what emerges from your continual evolution. Everyone's continual evolution. What the hell happened to the Stoa? We don't know if the Stoa is gonna be here in 2 months. So I mean, whatever happens, I mean, I'm just looking forward to it. Even with what happened yesterday. Oh yeah, that thing happened yesterday.
Oh yeah, that thing.
That thing. Oh yeah, we forgot in the conversation. That thing happened yesterday. It's funny. Like I refer to it as that thing, just like I refer to that little virus thing that it.
The other thing.
The other thing. Lots of things happening, but yeah. Let's just for like this hour and a half, just pretend like it doesn't exist and just chill, right? So again. Awesome. So thank you so much, Raven. So where can people learn more about the lovely and amazing Raven Connolly's social media links, resources? Where can people find you?
Yeah, I mean, I'm on Twitter at spiral_virus.
Got it.
I made that name before the pandemic
happened. I know, yeah. What are your thoughts on it right now? You're like, I still love the DNA, but it's like, yeah, that other thing. Yeah.
It's very funny to me that's okay, the kitty. Yeah, that's pretty much it. I am working on putting my ideas somewhere else in the world, on the internet.
Interesting. Okay.
I have groups that I'm going to be, like, I run this Bible study group, but I'm also going to be doing a weird theology group as well with a philosophy organization that I facilitate for. And we're going to be going into the emergence of the belief in extraterrestrials and
whoa, interesting.
That kind of stuff. So I'm looking at like emerging religions or proto-religions, open source religions like QAnon, for example. Yeah, a lot of my public facing stuff is actually workshops or facilitating that I'm doing, and so you can find that stuff. Or if you want to message me and ask me about that on Twitter, I'm totally open to that. But I'll be publishing my new stuff soon once it gets rolling.
Cool beans. Super excited about that. Again, Raven, one of the most amazing women out there, which is why I'm so glad that you were able to come on and share all your amazing knowledge and leak some of these amazing projects coming up. So again, thank you so much, Raven, for coming on. And that's it for another episode of Noetic Nomads. Peace out and step up because the world needs you. Okay, bye. All right, and we are